another episode of Grotto on the Tar Pit. I have a great guest for you guys tonight, Mr. Gary Wayne. He he's an expert in one of these subjects that's true to my heart, near and true. It changed my whole experience about, being a believer. When I first heard about Gen 6 and the Nephilim and things that uh, are not usually told to you in church, it changed my whole perspective on life, and it made so much sense. It connected a lot of dots for me. So, how you doing today, Gary?
Doing very well, and thank you for inviting me to your show. And so happy to be here, and so happy to talk to your audience. I just love to talk to new audiences. And if we do our jobs right, we're going to raise more than a few eyebrows, and we're going to raise some curiosity, and hopefully, for people who want to get more information on some of the things that we're going to talk about, which I think one of the things I kind of bring to the table that a lot of people don't do is I provide detail and sourcing and information that connects more dots and really can't find elsewhere, although my information does tend to get picked up after a year or so with other formats, but that's fine because it's all about getting information into the hands of the audience. Because as you said so succinctly, our churches do not teach prehistory and they do not teach prophecy. And they teach some great values, but they're missing the whole context and our reason for being and how we got here.
I think one of the things that as I think was changed as a culture is now when people go to church, they just go not wanting to learn, but they just want that feel good message. Like, yeah, I'm gonna feel good for the next 15 minutes, then I'm gonna go
Yeah,
home.
yeah.
And a lot of times, the church services you go to have changed from in depth and um, the pastor not holding back and letting you know that there is fire and brimstone. You know, and it's turned more into of a rock concert where you just go and rock out for a day and you know that just the feel good type of thing.
It is, and it's not that going to church shouldn't be fun. You should want to go, but it's also there to not only replenish your spirit, but it's supposed to be there to prepare you for the world that we live in, so that you can put on all the armor of God, and that you're not going to be deceived, because we live in a world that's not run by God at this point in time. He's permitting, the council of the gods to run this world. And of course, Satan sits above that council of gods that's talked about in Psalms 82, and that Satan is the prince of this world until the end time. And so, just by sort of implication, is that we have an interesting, intimate relation with the invisible realm of the angels, both loyal and fallen, and we're not explained that whole interaction and why we're here.
Yeah. Okay. I really don't have a format for this. Kind of wanted to go free form.
Yep.
We were recently on a different podcast together, and you seen that for any questions, and it went pretty well. So one thing I want to ask about you,
Yeah.
how did you come to the Lord?
Yeah. It was a long sort of path back. I was raised in a Christian church. I got brainwashed in the education system and peer pressure, and walked away from the church, and was total buy into evolution, secular society, you know, living in a huge universe of aliens, you name it. I was in it. And I was 20 or 21, and my brother and a friend were over, and they were into the beers and into the evening, and they were starting to talk about Antichrist and false prophet. And I'm going, that's interesting, because at that time there was movies out about Antichrist and stuff like that, but that's about all that I really knew about it. And then one of them turned to me and said, how much courage do you have? Because if you have enough courage, you have a book for you to read. And I wasn't sure what book that they were going to ask me to read, but it was, they were talking about a book that was written by Hal Lindsey. It's called The Late
Late
Great
Great Planet Earth.
Planet Earth. Yeah. So
Oh, sorry about that.
I read it, and it scared the socks off of me. But I wasn't ready to come back. I thought, I know all the hucksters that are on television on Sundays just raising money and misleading people, and they had a bad reputation with them, a lot of corruption in the 80s. And I
So
thought,
just to get this right, you had already forgotten about the faith. You took it
yeah,
as a myth now,
yeah,
and just by reading that book, now you're back into it. Like, oh my God, it's
yeah,
true.
yeah. If he's even half right,
Yeah.
I better pay attention to what Hal was talking about. He was a prolific writer, so the only way I could verify whether he was being accurate was I had to read the Bible, and that's a big project. And then I
Yes.
realized,
Especially
as
Leviticus.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh,
Once you hit Leviticus.
and the Old Testament is really dry, so to have me sort of specialize in that, I mean, I couldn't even read the King James Version Bible. I came back with the NIV Bible
Yeah,
because
that's
the
what I did too.
KJV made my mind go to mush. I just was not understanding what I was reading, so I had to sort of work my way back into, and I use 6 translations now because I'm a bit of a nerd on this stuff, but and Bible Hub and other great
You got
features that helps you compare passages. So,
you have a good
and
parallel Bible.
yeah, you should, because they translate a little bit differently and they're
Yeah.
not necessarily wrong. And what you learn kind of quickly, once you get behind the English and into the original Greek or the original Hebrew for the New and Old Testament, respectively, there, that the original words have multiple meanings. Some are nuanced, some are completely diametrically opposed, and
Yeah. No.
depending on the translation that they're selecting, it has a bend to how you might interpret that. So it's important to understand that. So that's how I got back, because I needed to log the Bible. I needed to log the narratives, and along the way, as I'm, like especially in the first reading and definitely in the second reading, was when I got to the New Testament and those first 4 Gospels. It just struck me like lightning that that is not the words of a human. That is speaking in Mark and Matthew and John and Luke. And so I was really paying attention at this point, because now I'm scared, and now I know I don't know enough about why I'm so scared. So I started to log all the prophecy narratives. So as you're going through the Bible, you find out that you can't do it with highlighters. It's just not enough colors. Start with a few files. You don't have enough files, but I'm handwriting passages on every topic of the prophecy narrative into files. And as I'm going along, I get to Genesis 6 and all of the reads and all of the logging and the several, I would be like probably 5 or 10 years worth of work before I'm
And
prepared to
is that
deal
where
with
things
Genesis
changed?
6. Yeah,
Is that where everything changed?
because what happened is I'm reading Genesis 6 and it's talking about giants, and I'm going, whatever that's all about, that's not what I'm here for. And it was just a cognizant dissonance that was in my brain. But because they kept coming up, like you have the angelic realm coming up, you have demons, you have evil spirits, and they're showing up in the book of Revelation and in the New Testament, I'm thinking, this seems to be something important that I need to know. I don't know why I need to know it, but I better just log it, and just maybe sometime down the road I might deal with it. So that's how I got back. And then when I had all my research done, which took me about 15 or 16 years just on the Bible aspect, then I decided, well, I could write a number of books on prophecy. But
So
I
when
don't
you
have you.
started when you started your journey, how old were you and what year was this? Not to date you or anything, but
Yeah, I would say the date was about 1980 or 81, in that zone. I didn't write it down at the time, but I knew where I was living, and so it's got to be within uh, those couple of years when I started to do the research. And so I thought I would just write a short book, and I don't have a university degree. I am not a theologian. I'm not a minister. I don't
me
believe
neither.
I'm a prophet, and I have had no platform and not considered an expert. But I know what I read, and I know what research I did, and I'd already put so many things into prophecy narratives so I could handle and understand each of the narratives, and then be able to fit them all together. So I decided, well, maybe I could do something really easy, and I could connect Genesis 6 with the Book of Revelation, and I could see whether I could actually write a story. And then if I did, would somebody publish it? And if somebody published it, would somebody buy it? And if they bought it, would they read it? And would they like it? And I didn't know any of that. So I wrote the first 10 chapters and I wrote it fairly fast. But one of the things that I was when I was young was a history buff and a mythology buff. And I knew all throughout that there's a connection there between Genesis 6 and the polytheist accounts of the same events all around the world, both before and after the flood. And I thought Christians need to know that that's talking about a very similar thing, whether it was identical until you really get into the minutiae of the details and you learn that it is the identical story of the same type of beings and the same type of events and the same type of things that were going on. It's identical all around the world in a way that is only consistent with the flood, and the flood story is consistent to giants all over the world as part of the same story.
What stood out incredibly,
I decided I needed to put that in.
What stood out a lot to
Go
me
ahead.
is basically like you've read Enoch, right? Well, when we
Yep.
start going into Enoch and the fallen angels, and I start thinking about the things that they're talking about, right? And you start hearing about Mount Hermon, right? And the pact that the 200 Watcher angels made on Mount Hermon. And you think about it, then you think about Greek mythology, right? And in Greek mythology, you have a pantheon of gods. You got Zeus, you know, and all Hera, and you know his whole consort, and they're on top of Mount Olympus, right? And they got powers. And then you think back into the historical documents and as well as the Bible, and there you got a bunch of angels, a bunch of fallen angels on top of this mountain. And you think about it, they have powers, right? They're not actual human beings. They're fallen angels. They can do things that we can't. They might be able to call down thunder. They might be able to do this and this and affect the elements and do things that a normal person at the bottom of the mountain is going to be saying, hey, man, there's a bunch of gods that live up there.
Yeah. So it's interesting, as you dig into all of this, and I'll use Mount Hermon as an example. And, a lot of Christians will say, don't bring in the book of Enoch or don't use the Apocrypha. And I get that. But when it's identical to what the Bible says, it's affirming something. It's another testimony, whether it's Apocrypha or not. And we don't have the complete manuscript in Hebrew of the book of Enoch. We only have fragments, so it's hard to declare its veracity, but there's a consistency there, and there's some places where it parts, but I look for the consistency aspect. So on that mountain, which is called Mount Hermon there, or Aramon, I think it's called both, depending on the translations that you're reading, and it is the place where they took an oath. This is the starting of our oath-based society, anathema. So one of the ways we know it has a parallel back to the original Hebrew is they use a lot of terms that only go back to Hebrew, and they have specific meanings. So anathema is a Judaic ecclesiastic term to carry things out to the end, no matter the punishment, which was usually the most extreme punishment you could have. And haram is the Hebrew word Cherem, Charam, both for curse and accursed. This is the accursed oath of Haramathema to carry out their plan to create giants, to destroy humankind from the face of the earth, and to do it no matter the consequences.
Well, not just giants, and hybrids, right?
Yeah, giants is just the beginning of what they're going to do and how they're going to corrupt the whole earth and the whole land, everything on the land, as Genesis 6 and Genesis 7 says. That's the Hebrew word shakath, and that means to spoil, to pervert, to ruin, to destroy. And all flesh was corrupted. All things on the land were corrupted. That means the DNA. That means the plant genome. So now if you want to know why Noah or God calls the animals to the ark as best representatives of the species that were uncorrupted by the technology of the fallen angels given to their spurious offspring, the giants, and other creations that they would have created as well, is that he called the ones that were physically pure to start into the new world, just as he called the eight, both spiritually and physically, to be pure to repopulate the earth afterwards. And
Now,
all of a sudden,
one
things
question,
start to make some sense.
one question, Gary, while we're on this subject. It says they corrupted all flesh, so we get the different kinds of like, let's say the Minotaur and the Centaur, where the fallen
Yeah.
angels probably didn't just mate with a woman; they probably mated with a horse or a bull, and created this
Yeah.
creature. Now, how much of that do you think was
Depending on the
in?
creature.
Yeah, how much of that do you think was in a magical fallen angel transformed themselves into something
Yep.
like, let's say uh, uh, uh half goat or whatever, they transform
Yep.
themselves into something in order to
Yep.
be able to do that. And how much, or do you think there was some element of the technology being so advanced like it is today that they could actually
Yep.
manipulate the genome through technology?
Yes. When we're talking about angelic technology, it's almost at par with God. Obviously, it can't be, but it's, and again, it's hard to imagine how much power God has, but by inference, the angels, which are super beings, have a lot of technology, and so that's why we see things that were built before the flood that we can't do today. Whether it's Machu Picchu, whether or not it's Chichen Itza, whether or not it's the Great Pyramids, whether or not, you go Baalbek, you go all around the world, you have these things that we can't do the same masonry, move the same type of weight. We can't encode sacred geometry into it. We can't encode and do it with all of the Earth and other planet ratios that are in there, and also aligned to constellations. And so many of are aligned with the solstice and the equinox. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of some of the things. There's a great technology that they had, so much so that they likely had the ability to destroy the world by fire, which isn't permitted according to 2 Peter 3 until the end time. So hence the flood, which God promises never to bring again. So yes, they had significant technology. So now if they're going to create different creatures, it implies DNA capability. So we get the term chimera out of Greek history, and chimera was beings that were created by the gods, seemingly with some sort of DNA manipulation, because they have multiple kinds of animals, different, it might have a tail of a serpent, they might have the feet of a bird, they might have the face of whatever. And so there's something else going on other than just procreating with an animal or something to do that. Could be DNA manipulation. Now the centaurs, which are half human and half horse, they were created by Hera in Greek mythology in a cloud off the earth. That's just really weird, and
In a
created in a
cloud?
different way than in a cloud. Then other giants were created before the flood by the parent gods, or the giants created by the offspring gods after the flood. So in that analogy, Kronos is the parent god, head of the Olympian gods before the flood. Zeus and Poseidon, those are offspring gods. They overthrow the parent gods, and they rule for a short period after the flood. So there's something going on there. Now, typically we understand the word demigod out of the Greek language, and it would be semi-devos or semi-deus out of the original Indo-Aryan, which is the basis for a lot of our historical understanding of the languages, and it tells a story in itself, because this is the language of the giants, both before and after the flood, the Indo-Aryan language. So it's why it has such a Indo-Aryan, Indo-European, it's also known as PIE when you look up etymology, Proto-Indo-European. That's the original language that's going to merge with the languages from the people leaving Babel. So they're the aboriginals in the land afterwards. The people from Babel go and live amongst the giants, and you're going to get a lot of those words because they're going to take over the kingships. Now, back
And
to
they
where I
also
was,
got.
demigod.
I said that they also got similar understandings because you think of the European religions, like let's say the Greek and the Norse and stuff like that. It matches a lot of the Indian mythologies. Like they
Yeah,
all have this trinity. Like Kali,
yeah.
Vishnu, and I forgot what the other one, Brahma, right? The three of them, and then you got Horus, you got Isis, and you got who is it? Osiris. It's basically the same religion everywhere you go.
It Same pantheon,
Yeah.
just different vernacular names. Absolutely, both before and after the flood. And so I'm not sure quite where I was. Oh, so demigod means half god. So, and by implication, because it's defined as the offspring of a god and a human male, or a goddess let's say a god and a human female, and a goddess or a male. And they created giants both before and after the flood, and created differently than the centaurs, who are going to be the mentors and the teachers to the giants,
Now
which
I'm
is
not
another
sure.
interesting relationship of these sort of Nephilim, larger Nephilim type of creatures.
Now have you heard about
So in in
some of
in
these
the
people
in
actually being real people? Like from what I hear, they have an actual grave for Hercules.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there could have been two Hercules, one before the flood and one after the flood. And in the Greek accounts, they have one that was a god and one that's a demigod. So we understand Hercules as being different, but it seems to be more closely related than Hercules to the original sort of god that would have, or giant that might have been before the flood. So, um, yeah, these are actual people. These are actual individuals. So, like Perseus,
Mhm.
you know, also son of Zeus, just as Hercules was son of Zeus and Alcmene, a female,
And
and
I heard of.
Herculides. He starts a Herculides bloodline of kings, and that is what we understand as the Gyges kings, or Gaies in its plural format, and where the name Gog is associated both before and after the flood with bloodlines of kings.
And again, these are real people and across different religions. Like Hercules, supposedly his
Yeah.
birthday was December 25th, same as Mithras, and same as Horus.
Yep.
You can tell it's the same person
Yep.
because they have the same attributes as a god, and they have the same birthdays. That there's so many things.
That's
So
Yeah. And that's one of the ways you connect a god that had a similar name sort of back to Hercules, which would be sort of the offspring. So Mithra is the god of Mithraism, but also a god in Zoroastrianism, which was the religion of the Nephilim. Mithra, um, it is the allegorical base for the term Lord Maitreya, for the Eastern Antichrist figure coming in the end time. So
that's the
it
New
comes
Age stuff too,
from,
huh?
yeah. So it comes from Mitre, like in the hat. That's that Sumerian fish sort of hat that the priest would wear. And Mithra is the original H isn't there in the old languages. H is kind of evolved. So like you might see Nephilim with that was Nephilim, so no H. Or you might see in the Ugaritic text Raphaim as RPM in the original vowelless and no H in the original Semitic. So
I thought that
it's
was
kind
the
of
difference
important to
between a pay and a fay.
what?
Wouldn't that be the difference between the pay and the fay in Hebrew? Like all
Yeah,
it is.
yeah, it is. There's an evolution of the language, so it goes from original Semitic and it's vowelless. So the original spelling would be RPM on Raphaim and NPL on Nephilim, and under Gibor or Gibberim it would GBR, and then you have the vowels that are coming in, and then you're having an H introduced as the language sort of evolves
Now, what would you think of
And
Hebrew as the oldest Semitic language, or do you think that there was an earlier precursor to Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic and all that?
well, I think the original Hebrew is probably from the original Semitic. And so there may
But I'm
be a
saying, do you
couple
think that was the original
variations
language?
of the
You,
original, but
you think that was the original language before the
well,
before
I
the
think
Babel?
well, it would be you would think it would be the language that came from Noah, right? Because whatever he's speaking is what the humans are going to speak. It's not Indo-Aryan, it's not Indo-European, but it's going to be a language that Noah spoke. So it's going to be antediluvian, and it's likely Hebrew, but we don't have scripture for that. But what we can do is take its original form back that's almost identical, but just some variations of original Semitic. Which is really good if you're comparing like the Ugaritic text in the original Semitic to the Hebrew and how it's translated. So as we're sort of mixing that into the understanding of these Nephilim, is that these were um, a mix of God and human, as it's described with demigod. But what's interesting in the Sumerian tradition, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that has creation of giants with Gilgamesh after the flood. And yes, there's a Gilgamesh before the flood too. That's in the Enoch book of giants. This is sixth generation after the flood. He is the son of King Lugalbanda of Uruk, meaning large king, giant king, and then the fertility bull goddess. And he's called the bull because you have giants and gods that are called bulls in most cultures around the world. The offspring were bulls as well. So when you hear the bulls of Bashan, Bashan's from Mount Hermon, home of the Council of the Gods, as you referenced earlier. And when Jesus is on the cross, as it's recorded in the book of Psalms, he's being taunted by the bulls of Bashan. These are the demon spirits of the giants, and these are the fallen angels that are taunting them. So in the Sumerian text, Gilgamesh is classified as two-thirds God, one-third human, which is different than 50-50. And now introducing an idea that perhaps you can split DNA or the amount of divine entity that's in there. And Enkidu is also two-thirds God, one-third human. And Upnapishtim, or Zayazudra in other translations of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is also two-thirds God, one-third human, and he's a survivor of the flood. He's the Greek Noah. I mean, the Sumerian Noah, as a lot of people um, try to conflate the two. There's two separate accounts. So the details are completely different.
And then there
The
was
overall story is the same.
what about
And all of
Nimrod?
his family are giants. He becomes a Gibor, a
Yeah,
Gibborim.
because he
Something
becomes a
changes.
mighty
He's son
man.
of Cush.
so
Yeah,
so
and it's a
so could that
Hebrew
be
word.
something? Could that be something like gene splitting yourself? Like today they have CRISPR-Cas9 where they
Yeah.
inject themselves with something and it starts turning them, messes with their
Something
RNA.
happens. Something happens that he begins to be a mighty one. Gibor, Gibborim, which is generally used to describe giants, not in 100% of the cases in the Old Testament, but a lot of times. It's the Hebrew word Kal-El. And Kal,
Superman.
yeah.
I guess that's where they get it.
Yes, and of course Superman's father's name is Jor-El, from the house of El. El is the parent god of Canaan before the flood. Baal is his son.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
you,
You
you,
can't make this
you
stuff
can't
up.
you can't make this up. And a hero was a giant. So Superman from the house of Hell is a
Yeah.
superhero, a house of El, not hell, I guess. But it's all the superheroes are based on giants. So now, so where I'm going with this is that there are different watchers. There are four groups of watchers, and it's the watchers that originally go to the sons of the daughters of men to create giants in the Bible. So seraphim are the main proponent, and they are serpent-faced gods with six wings. They're known as angelic dragons, and they're fiery copper. And so when they take a physical form, and create their own soul and body to put their heavenly spirit in. And we know the fallen angels left their dwelling place who did the crimes at the time of the flood from Jude 1:6, because they left their habitation, which is the Greek word oiketerion, that means dwelling place for the spirit. And it's also used one other time for house in heaven in 2 Corinthians 5:2, and that's a dwelling place in heaven, just as we have a dwelling place here. So the spirit merges with the soul.
One thing I
And
wanted
now,
to talk to you about while we're on that subject, I'm so glad you brought it up, is one way that I like to think of it is that they left their fifth dimensional spiritual bodies for third dimensional physical bodies, right? Now,
well,
mhm.
they dwell in the soul. It merges with that soul, but they interact physically in the world, as opposed to being an opalescent or spirit being, so that you could eat, so that you could have sex, so that you could pass on DNA. You would require a soul and a body. That's of the physical world. The spirit comes from heaven. Now, the counterfeit spirit that goes into the giant doesn't come from heaven. That's where the evil spirits come from. That's where the demon spirits come from. And so
kind of off subject, but while we're on it, is maybe that's do you know what a tesseract is?
nope.
No, it's like a fifth dimensional box. Like, you know how you have a square and then you have a cube. Well,
Yep.
if you expand beyond time and to the next dimension, you got what's known as a tesseract. Now, basically, every time you get an angle, you go 90 degrees, right? So 90 degrees, 90 degrees, in each direction, linked with height. Now you got a three-dimensional. So if you go past time and you go another dimension, that means you would need another 90 degrees. Well, we can't physically see that in this reality. So it's got to be somehow mixed in there somewhere to a plane we do not see. It's rolled into this one. So if
interdimensional.
Now we don't know, we can't actually see one, but we do know what its shadow looked like. And they've plotted it out, and the shadow is kind of moving. It's going in and out of itself. If you ever get a chance to see what it looks like, maybe I kind of, the reason I brought this up is because it makes it look like it's going in and out of itself. So if you like, kind of like that, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So if you were to look at my body and imagine it going in and out of itself, it might be the expression of some of the things that they put in the Bible about this angel had 8 eyes and wings and 4 different faces.
Yeah, it sounds like an Ophanim out of the Book of Enoch.
And
that's one of the Watcher groups. And that's the wheel angel that's in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10. And 2 words are used for wheel in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10. One is Gilgal, as in Gilgal Raphaim, that's at the foot of Mount Hermon with the wheel of the giants or wheel of the spirits. And the other one is Ophan. So when it's referring to the wheels that are going around and interacting, that's Gilgal. And when it's referring to the cherubim-like angel, which is a little bit distinct from the cherubim that pulls the chariot, it has a face of a chariot. It has one face that's different. They have 4 faces. And that's the Hebrew word Ophan. That's where in the book of Enoch, Ophanim comes from, as that throne angel. That's part of the Watchers. Now, the seraphim were Watcher angels, and a lot of people put them right at the apex. They may have been one time. I think I might put the archangel a little bit higher, but that's just my opinion. But the seraphim, when they took a physical form and became gods in this physical world, when you see the feathered serpent or the plume serpent and Quetzalcoatl, or all the different variations for the name of those serpent gods in Central and South America, that's a seraphim angel. When you see Osiris depicted as an Uraeus god, which is a serpent-winged serpent god, and Isis, that's a seraphim angel. Most of the pantheons around the world are dragons or serpents, and dragons and serpents are the same understanding in antiquity. And so,
to me, the Quetzalcoatl has always been the devil, because it is a plume serpent that turns himself into a fire-eyed white man.
Yeah. So, yeah, and the offspring were white for the most part. And
so that means
so,
probably when he transformed, he probably had red hair too.
Yeah. Well, you would have dark hair, you have red hair, and you have blonde hair. But the color of white is different than we would understand. It would be really pale, like Day of the Dead painting or
Yeah.
shaman painting your face white in terms of that sort of color. So when they produced offspring, they produced kings that looked just like them, giants that looked like them with a serpent face. That's why before the flood and for a short period after the flood, all the kings are depicted as serpents. And even Akhenaten, over 1,000 years after the flood, you look at that face, you're looking at a serpent's face, diluted in bloodlines through intermarriage through humans so that they don't go extinct, but serpentine nonetheless, with that long chin, high cheekbones, large wraparound eyes that would glow and light up a room, and this elongated skull that doesn't have any sutures and has way more volume than what a human skull could ever have. It's from a giant skull, that's why. And so they can pass on their DNA. So now if you go back to the idea of the cherubim and the Ophanim, and we'll use the cherubim, you have a face of a human, you have the face of a bull, you have the face of a lion, and you have the face of a bird or an eagle. And lo and behold, we get accounts of lion men of Moab, lion-like men of Gad after the flood. We get the Urmalu in Sumeria and other names for these lion warriors before the flood as well. And we get a god that's listed in the Bible named Nergal of the Sumerian pantheon that the Avim giants worshipped in the Mesopotamian region. And he's depicted as this lion face and worshipped by giants. And we have, after the flood, these lion men of Moab that seems to be connected back to lion face gods. And you have lion face gods in most pantheons. So that seems plausible. You also have Tengu gods that are understood in Japan and China and Southeast Asia, and they're a classification of the Watchers different than the Seraphim, different than the dog-faced god. And they produced Tengu warriors that if you Google Tengu, you are going to get a bird-faced warrior.
What about the dog-faced men? Apparently, there's dog-faced men.
There.
Oh, okay.
I'll get there. Yeah. And in the Popol Vuh, you have the Xibalba. And the Xibalba are demigods that lives in this other dimension and in this other world. Same sort of story. They're the offspring of the gods, and they're owl-faced giants. And then you also have the house of Camazotz in the Popol Vuh. And Camazotz is understood as the house of the bat. It's a branch of the Xibalba. So if you Google Camazotz, you can't make this up as you connect back to superheroes.
Batman.
You get the image of Batman's outfit. It's absolutely freaky. And so it all seems to be, these superheroes are all based on ancient giants. And so we have a mythos, as you were talking about, that comes with us all the way through history. It's talked about in multiple cultures, and it's the dog mythos and dog men. But they're like a dog Nephilim, and they're great warriors and they're mercenaries, both before and after the flood. So we get a god in the Egyptian pantheon named Anubis. And he's a jackal god. And jackal gods are part of the definitions of some of the angelic realm recorded in the Bible. So jackal is something we need to pay attention to. And this jackal god Anubis produced so many offspring dog giants. They had a city named Sinopolis in Egypt for all of these dog people. And cynocephalus is the Greek term for the dogmen mythos that people refer to, meaning dog. And so
now while you're on there, did you ever hear about this one guy that was a dog-faced man and ended up becoming a Catholic priest and
Saint Christopher
became a saint?
Yeah. So in the Roman version, he's not depicted as a dog. He's just depicted as coming from North Africa, where the dog-faced uh, legend comes from as well, and more of a Canaanite, which again is part of the overall history of it. But the Greek Orthodox depict him with a dog's face and a giant dog face and a warrior and a mercenary. So yes, they and I have a great document for people who want to get a hold of me on the. I have what's in the Bible. I have what's the church's accounts are, and I have what the seculars and the history says about this dog mythos, coming from multiple historians. And so we have a God that we can connect it back to the Bible from, listed in the Bible. And again, it's one of the gods that this Avim giant group that was also in the Palestine region and the Gaza region, as we would know today. And his name is Nibaz, Nibaz. And when you take that back to the Hebrew meaning, it means a barking God. And that the Avim worshipped him with a human body and a dog's head.
Wow, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so it's understanding the Oiketerian concept and the different kinds of angels that have different looks to them, which starts to account for a lot of these creatures that they said that's recorded in polytheism throughout the world. And some of them we have data points reference from the Bible.
And then, like we were talking before on the other podcast, is then you also got other types of Nephilims, like the fairies and the leprechauns, and the Homo florentia, and
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah. So in books like Galatians and um, you have this group called the elementals that enslave us, and they're part of the visible hierarchy that answers to the invisible ones. These are understood as a type of being that is working with these invisible ones, just like the Nephilim do. And so elementals are understood in the occult into four different groups. But the point thing is stoichion is the Greek word for that's translated as element or rudiment. Now you can also have element used to describe the basic elements of the universe, but it's a different application and context that it's being used, and it's not enslaving us. So it's these specific elementals that are enslaving us, and that stoichion is translated. So if you see rudiment, that's the same word, same meaning, and it's this type of being. And so in the occult, you have four groups of elementals. Three are little ones, and one is a little bit larger and is a little higher in the hierarchy. And it's a reptilian salamander, and it's larger than a human. It's kind of equated with some of the reptilian aliens and the ones that live in the earth. It's kind of in that sort of understanding. The three little ones, they have mischievous ones like leprechauns. You have good-looking ones, and you have ugly ones. And the ugly ones also connect into the alien mythos, particularly with the gray gnomes who kidnap people, come through portals, flying machines, there's sexual experimentation on it. In book one, I put 2 fairy abductions in the descriptions. If you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you'd swear it was a gray alien because the descriptions are the same, including the beings. And
Yeah,
so
they would take babies and stuff like that, right?
yes, they would. Yeah, and humans for a period of time, and you would come back with no memory. It's
Yeah,
exactly the same layout as the common MO for aliens
and the
today.
abductions.
So,
Yeah,
and again, the leprechauns with those four groups are understood on all continents in all cultures around the world. And we get a reference to these elementals who are part of those ones who try to enslave us in this physical world that's run by the council of the gods that Satan sits atop of as the god of this world.
yeah. So back to your story. So you had finished. You had done all this research now,
Yeah.
and you did the first 10 chapters of your book to see if it was,
Yeah.
if there was an audience for it, and then what
Yep.
happened?
Well, then I decided, because of my understanding of mythology and history, that I think Christians might appreciate that you have polytheist accounts talking about the same events, same types of creatures and beings, just from using a polytheist lens versus the monotheist lens. So then I started to put that in. Then I realized, well, a lot of Christians, and they're taught not to, they wouldn't know much about the polytheist religions. So then I thought, well, I have to, get into the religion so that I can be able to, talk about what was the religion of the Mesopotamians and the Indo-Aryans. What were the Vedas, what are the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Indo-Aryans that settled in there? What do they have to say? What does Buddhism have to say? What does Gnosticism has to say? I've already mentioned the Popol Vuh. So I had to read all of these books to get an understanding of the religion. And then I got hit on this understanding that this religion is a knowledge cult that goes back to the original 7 sciences. And that it's the sciences that are going to be put into this sun worshiping bull cult before the flood to keep the development of that knowledge secret. And that this religion is started by Enoch, son of Cain, versus Enoch, son of Jared. And he's going to take the knowledge that Adam learns. I won't go through all of this, but it's based in this understanding of Cain is developing knowledge that he learned from Adam. Enoch puts it in the 7 sciences. And then that merges with the angelic knowledge that's going to emerge with the creation of the giants in about the 6th generation after before the,
Now, for the people listening for the people listening that do want to get the rest of that information, they can get it in one of your books, right?
Book 1. For
Genesis,
that in particular, yes. And I go through it in great detail, and it's very enlightening. And that they started the mystery schools where they would teach the Indo-Aryan elite, the nobles, the nobility class, and not the humans that's in the 3rd and 4th class.
And you know what I find kind of crazy is that you got these the Indo-Aryans, right? You got the Nephilim, basically they were the Nephilim, and later on, out there in Germany, you got Adolf Hitler trying to go back to these Aryan people, trying to purify their race and go back to these Nephilim. Yeah, that is some crazy stuff to look at.
And I have a full chapter devoted to that in book 1 on how they take that back to, they believe that the Aryans were giants, blonde hair, blue-eyed giants and pale skin, and that they were trying to backwards engineer to recreate those giant races and that divinity for their 3rd Reich, which was a false sort of millennium that Antichrist figures always try and promise. So this merges with that whole organizational structure, both before and after the flood. So in the Gnostic and secret societies versions, you have Hermes or Harmine, who's going to take this knowledge that has been stored under the Great Pyramids in 9 vaults and in 36,525 books written by Enoch, son of Cain. And he's going to take this knowledge to, guess who, Nimrod at Babel, who's going to use this knowledge to build Babel Tower and Babel City. And he initiates 1,000 Masons in that parallel kind of history. And that Nimrod writes the first constitution for the Masons after the flood. And that Masonry takes their secret societies back to this merging of the 7 sciences into the mystical religion, which they worship as Gnosticism. And that the secret societies come out of the mystery schools, just as you have initiatory societies in universities today that teach the 7 sacred sciences or the 7 liberal arts. And Skull and Bones, an Illuminati one, would be sort of a classic example for the Ivy League pseudo blue bloods. So you have this historical sort of connection, and that now you have a possibility that there's knowledge of the angels that could destroy the world by fire. May have been what Nimrod might have used ritually and sexually, as Kal-El means, to make himself a Gibborim.
So while we're at it, just like Adolf Hitler, he was trying to purify this this hidden element within the bloodlines, right? Trying to make it stand out, or basically, make it a stronger by interbreeding or whatever it be. But in your understanding, that actual tracer, that marker, is a Rh negative blood?
It's a manifestation of the marker.
Mhm. So
So the difficulty that,
so not basically in your mind, not everybody who's Rh negative doesn't have has, or there are some people that are Rh negative and are not evil, and that also have the ability to be saved and stuff like that, right?
yeah, just because you're born innocently with Rh negative blood doesn't dictate your salvation.
Right.
And even if the
But
sins
you
were
might be
passed
more
on from
prone.
if sins were passed on from the father or the mother, um, you would even in Old Testament law, the sins don't pass on past the third or fourth generation. So at some point, the spirit starts to come from heaven for the descendants. And that, I think Jesus' sacrifice is stronger than and bigger than all the sins of the world, except for the sins against the Holy Spirit, which this seems to be part of, creating giants, gods in the world. So yes, they will have an influence from the genes. And we can talk about some of those traits if you want, but
Yeah.
doesn't dictate your salvation. So it's
But
the
like I was saying,
gene.
it could also be like a presupposition, even though you say it doesn't necessarily mean that. It could be like a generational curse, you could say, just like
Yeah, sure.
someone who's predisposed to be an alcoholic because their parents were
Yeah.
alcoholics, something like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah, they will say they have a lot more occult experiences, a lot more alien encounters, and a number of other traits that are associated with it. So lower
kind
blood
of like
pressure.
the people that end up in the Montauk projects and stuff like that. They're already predisposed. They're predisposed because
Yep,
their family member was
yep,
already traumatized and they did this
yep.
to this. So they focus on their kids because they're gonna be easier to do that to, type of thing.
Yes, yep, yeah. They're more prone, and their parents are probably more prone and maybe part of the bloodlines because to join the secret societies, you have to be invited. So they're looking for that gene, that genealogy in the Rh negative blood. It's the gene that you have to focus on because you can't add something that's not there into the blood types. So what an Rh negative means is missing the D antigen. So how do you add something that's not there? You can't, so it's something else. And what happens is that with the genes, it's the genes that produces the blood type and generally passes down in their belief system through the matriarchal side, and that it can also skip a generation as that passes. So it doesn't always show up in every generation. And so when we look at that word gene and genealogy, they call it, the gene of Isis is one of the allegories, or the fairy genes, or the elven gene. And when you get into the specific genes, the elven gene is the LB gens, um, which means pale white, and from a specific patriarch, as you take that back to Albi, probably Albion. It could be a matriarch in there as well, like Alberta or a word like that. I cover some of that off in book 2, but there's also the Julia gens that's out there. That is the bloodline of the original 100 families of the Romans and the senators that we might see part that would come down to Julius Caesar and Augustus, that they would take their bloodlines back. That's the bloodline of Romulus and Remus from their parent god Ares, from their celestial mafia godfather, as I like to call him. Now, we talked about Hercules from Zeus. That's the Creta gens. There are different genses around the world. The Anjou uh, believe they have the Plantagenista gens. That seemingly is associated with this Elven gens. And Elven is like elf or fairy, and the matriarchal allegory of the bloodline is fairy or owl versus raven or dragon on the patriarchal bloodline of the giants. And that these genses are tracked in their genealogies because wherever the royales fit in the purity of that bloodline or ennobling of other bloodlines in is where they sit in the overall culture. So, for example, the Windsors, which is
Yeah, I
the
was just about to
original
ask
Hanover,
where do they fall in? Because
they're O negative.
they're all negative.
Yeah.
Uh, and what bloodline do they come from? Because I'm not sure. where you stand, but there are quite a few people that think Prince Charles might, or King Charles now, might actually be the Antichrist because of his heraldry and his
Sure.
bloodlines and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Well, he would be I wouldn't say Prince Charles necessarily. I think I mean, King Charles III now, as he's called, it would necessarily be Antichrist, but William might be a better bet just because Charles is old and not that healthy. So we want to be careful because we don't know exactly when Antichrist is going to come, but there's going to be multiple Antichrists. So until the one who negotiates the covenant and then is crowned at the abomination at the midpoint of the last 7 years, we want to be careful. And Antichrist is going to need a counterfeit Antichrist to declare his mythos and pedigree as the false Messiah. So he needs an Armageddon that happens before Armageddon. And so we want to be careful of that as well. So you're asking his bloodline. Yeah. So that's the Hanovers out of Germany, and Saxe-Coburg also out of Germany. There's two different ones in there. And King Charles says he takes part of his genealogy back to Vlad the Impaler, that Dracula is based on. Yeah. And
Son of the Dragon.
Yeah, and son of a dragon. Yeah, dragon patriarchal bloodline is that allegory would go, and that they drink blood. So they had the other allegories. They're the enemy.
Apparently,
of
some of the people that they're close to call them lizards.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Reptilians, same thing. And so Vlad the Impaler took his genealogies back to the tribe of the Agrathi, which was a Hercules tribe. And then there's another scioning in there in Scythia from Tamiel as a fallen angel, which would be Kezidiah in the book of Enoch. And so he would at least have some of the...
Quesadilla.
Yeah. So, from the book of Enoch, one of the fallen watchers, right? So Tamiel is his other name. So
can we trace most of these? We can trace most of these
well, they do.
bloodlines to the 200 fallen angels, like Simiyaza or Azazel, or
they do. And there are other bloodlines as well in the West. So you have this tree trunk organization of secret societies, the Thelemic Tree. And you probably have heard of the Committee of 300. They're one of the trunk organizations. They're third from the top. That's the Committee of 300 families out of the Greek understanding. So they have an addition of 100 additional bloodlines on there. Above that is the Council of 33 families and the 13 families of the West on the top side. But you have bloodlines all over the world. So you have bloodlines that were all through South and North America from the Inga Roca, bloodline. So the Roca family is one of those bloodlines, and there's Aztec families, and they intermarried with the Spanish. I mean, they weren't all wiped out. In fact, just the original king was, and by 1525, both Portugal and Spain had put all the nobility back in place and then started to intermarry with them.
So you think the Aztec kings were Nephilim? Or
they are in all cultures. You have First Nations that are bloodline chiefs.
Yeah.
They go back to their creator gods. It's the same story all over the world, both before and after the flood. So, there's these different genses, and it's that gene of Isis and sort of the overarching matriarchal bloodline that produces the Rh negative for the carrying into generations. So they track those, and that's how they invite people through genealogies and blood type into the lowest level of the Thelemic secret societies, which is Freemasonry. And first level of adept is 3rd degree in the York Rite and 33rd degree in the Scottish Rite, and then it goes up from there.
And again, that 33rd degree goes back to Mount Hermon, because I guess when Paris, France was the prime meridian, it was 33 degrees east and 33 degrees north.
Yeah,
it would have been Mount Hermon. So
they use sacred numbers in everything that they do. So it's important to sort of understand that. So So the bloodlines are the royales. And if we look at that word royale, that comes from Old French royale, Roiel. Uh, and Al is a transliteration of El, which as in Baal, meaning Lord God. And El is an angel or a god. Roy means king. It comes from regal and regalis out of Latin, and rex. And rex and regalis out of Latin goes back to the Indo-Aryan word for reg, meaning to rule. And you can also take king back in the same sort of way. So again, we have the roots and the history within the terms. Royale means kings of God, so that they believe that they have the divine right to rule because they're the physical, spurious offspring of the celestial mafia godfather that runs the council of the gods, with Satan sitting at the top. And that
Would that be
when they have
that would basically be the 70 different lower
70,
gods for the 70 nations, because basically they didn't want to serve God, so he goes, okay, I'm going to give you each a demon to serve.
Yeah, and so they rule over you would imagine there has to be at least 70 gods as part of that council, and that there would be a hierarchy above that as well. So, but within the council, and it might be the tens of tens that the chief of tens, that the book of Enoch talks about, that there could be a chief of 7 of them that have 7 other gods that answer to them in the hierarchy to hit the 70. And again, 7 is a common number for the wandering stars and the sort of the post-diluvian representative of the main gods. So could be some consistency there, and that we get that number 70 from Deuteronomy 32. And these are the sons of the Most High that are talked about in Psalms 82. Same term as the sons of God in one is Ben Ha Elohim, and the other one is Ben Ha El Elyon. And Elyon is the God Most High. So it's the same sort of term as the sons of God that present themselves in Jude 1:6, 2:1, and we're at creation along with the morning star orders that we're celebrating in Job 38, 4-7. So when we look at the 70 nations, we get that from Deuteronomy 32, that is numbered by the number of patriarchs listed in the table of nations in Genesis 1 and First Chronicles, and also numbered by the sons of Israel or Jacob born in Egypt in Exodus 1:5, which is also 70. And by inference, Adam is the one that would have had 70 sons, as it's talking about Deuteronomy 32 before the flood, because it's a constant number. And when the parent gods were put into the pit prison, the offspring gods just rose up after the flood and rule over the same number of nations. And so the sons of Israel, as it's called, not the sons of God in the KJV, but other translations will use angels or God there. All of those translations are correct. And it's the nuance of understanding the Hebrew. So Israel is a compound word, that Israel is given as a new name to Jacob. Right? Yeah, so that's going to represent in that title 70 sons of Israel that are going to be representing the nations in the millennium in the future. Because Israel's not before the flood, and they weren't right after the flood. They're born through the Abraham bloodline, starting at 292 years after the flood. So you have this sort of oxymoron, or almost like a contradiction, until you understand that this is a title that was given to Jacob, that they took their name from a national name, and it comes from the Hebrew word Sarah and El. And it means, as the sons of God, they're Ben, and either as princes or as ruling, for Sarah of God. So these are the ruling sons of God Most High. And so this is understood in its original term to be equivalent to angels or sons of God, and equivalent to Psalms 82 or Genesis 6:4 in the terms of understanding them as angels. And so again, those 70 nations are ruled over by 70 gods. In this case, rebellious gods, but that's only for a period of time. So the Bible tells us information that lines up with what happens around the world. This is the same council. That's the council at Nippur in Sumerian history. It's the council of El and then Baal after the flood at Mount Saphon, which is a Semitic word for Mount Hermon, just as we get Sirion, Shinir, and Sion, S-I-O-N, as also names for Mount Hermon in the Old Testament. And that's where
They call it
Baal
Mount
has
Zion too?
Sion, S-I-O-N,
Oh.
different Hebrew word than
Then
Zion.
Okay.
But they conflate the two.
They're Mount Zion and our
do.
Mount Zion.
Yeah. And so that's, well, because that's their most holiest place on earth for the polytheists.
Yeah.
So
that's why they got the Temple of Pan.
Yes,
they did all
and the
child
gateway
sacrifices
and Baal's gateway to Hades or Sheol, that he would go back and forth between the underworld and this world every day to oversee his empire. So yeah, you have that council of the gods that was at Nippur. You have the same council, and where the word hierarchy comes from at Olympus, and that's the hierarchy or the organizational structure of the archons or the rulers. As you take that back to the original Greek, it's a sacred assembly of those gods, and it's a counterfeit of God's throne in heaven, right? But that's all that they have is the counterfeit.
Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you felt on this subject. I know you do believe that at least that some of the Apocrypha can be taken as historical documents. We don't hold them up to the status of Scripture, or they're not canon, but a lot of it is good history, right?
Yeah, I would say this to people is that wherever it runs consistent with Scripture in that text, you could apply it.
Okay.
Where it is diverging from Scripture, then you can consider it as interesting, but don't consider it as Scripture, because we don't get that in the canon. And if it is running opposite or against the direction or doctrine of Scripture or details of Scripture, then dismiss it.
Okay.
So dissect each one that way. Yeah.
That being said, well, one of the things, or one of the books that I found interesting, dealing with all this Nephilim stuff is and I'm not sure if we got into it, but the Testament of Solomon. Now, Solomon was given wisdom. It was given, riches and long life because he asked to rule for, basically do right by the people. Now, that being said, he had a lot of pitfalls because he did exactly what he wasn't supposed to do. He started taking foreign wives, started building these altars and stuff like that. And apparently, he lost his connection with God. And apparently, to get some of that, not to say that it says that in the book, but my take and other people's take on it is that some of his way to get control over the spiritual realm again was what, like they say in the Testament of Solomon, he was given a ring to have dominion over these spirits and the Nephilim. Basically, he found the highest demonic entity that controlled these entities that controlled the Nephilim, and he had the Nephilim build it. What's your take on all that?
Well, we don't get scripturally that he commanded demons. You can get that from the Quran. You can get that from the Testament of Solomon. So we don't have that ring scripturally. What we do know is Solomon was provided a lot of knowledge. Now, could he control knowledge, that knowledge and knowledge of the names of demons to control them? Quite possible, and that's how one of the ways that the occult says that they did it. But we want to be careful because the springboard from accepting the ring and controlling demons is that they add on now something you want to be very careful with, that he used the demons to build the temple. That seems totally antithetical to how God would have his most holy of locations built by.
Yeah.
So I'm not convinced that. What we do know biblically and both in the occult
But that's
the
also
knowledge.
some of the history behind Freemasonry.
Yes,
Freemasonry.
yes, and they draft Solomon as a black magic or magi, and was polytheist is their belief, and so
just for the people that don't know that there's two grimoires written supposedly by Solomon, the Lesser Key and the Major Key, and these are very high occult black magic books. So, and they're accredited to Solomon. Might not be, but
yeah, so they draft them in, but they draft most of the patriarchs into their belief system. And then they discount the parts of the Bible that they don't like. So you have to be careful with the polytheists because they're trying to create this global religion. They always have there, and they will try again with Babylon in the end time, and they'll draft all the patriarchs. And they will demote Jesus from deity status to prophet status and immortal. So it's all part of the longer term plan. So yeah, we want to be careful with add-ons in like that. And what happens with a lot of these books, there's either corruptions that have been put in, or they're more of a Gnostic gospel as you get into even more distortions. So
that's the Gnostic gospels and stuff like that. That's where I draw the line. Once they start taking away from the deity Jesus and stuff like that, then I just don't even read them.
Yeah. So and I've read all of these books and stuff, and so I'm not saying not to read them. I'm just saying you need to have a set of disciplines going in when you read it, and where I can't make it scripturally. And with the ring in this case is okay, he could have had a ring, but I'm not sure he would have needed the ring. But what I do know is it makes no sense that they use demons to build the temple. We do know that Hiram Abif set his builders and the knowledge that they had to build the palaces and the great temples to teach the Israelites how to do it and to do the metallurgy and everything for the gold overlays and everything else. But it wasn't done by demons. And I just sort of, and I know a lot of people like the Testament of Solomon, and I'm not saying it's 100% for a write-off. What I'm saying is I disagree with that. That doesn't seem to fit the MO of how the Bible's written.
Have you ever heard of Zendani Salomon?
Nope.
Supposedly it's the Nephilim prison of Solomon, that he built a prison strictly for monsters in Nephilim.
Well, I would say Rephaim, that he probably built the prison for, versus Nephilim. I make a distinction there. And that for people who don't understand what has happened in the Old Testament and with the continuous wars they were having with the giants, that went right up to the time of King Solomon. And that Solomon, after he strayed, God rose up to Nemesis bloodline descendants of the Horim giants, one in Seir and Edom, one in Syria. They're both part of the Horim race of giants, and Horim are classified as giants in Deuteronomy 2, but not as Nephilim giants, as Rapha or Rephaim giants. So we want to. That's why I make the distinction there, and that I have a chapter on Solomon and his wars and provide all that information in book 2 for people, just as I cover all of the giant wars of King David and how we know all the giants that he was dealing with, all the giant nations that they were being dealt with throughout the judges, all the giants and the Exodus wars. I cover all of that off in book 2.
Well, King David had some Nephilim mercenaries on him.
He did. He did. And, with his mighty men, he had a Makathim. And the Makathim were from Bashan, Mount Hermon region. They do not have a patriarch. So that's one of the reasons we know it's a giant nations. And Makkah was a matronymic and a patronymic name that was passed on with the titles. And that a Makathim was also one of the wives David married. Now, Makkah in the Mount Hermon region was outside the land of the covenant in terms of what David had. So he could do a treaty, and take a wife, although he shouldn't. And she's the daughter of Maacah is the name, so the matriarchal name being used there is the daughter of King Talmai. If that sounds familiar, King Talmai is part of the three kings that are named as Anakim in Numbers 13 in the Sky Report, and the three are Ahiman, Shashai, and Talmai. So you have this patronymic name coming down, and he's part of the Gesherim with a Makkah name that he's using for his daughter. And so Makkah is going to produce through David Absalom. Absalom, in partnership with Talmai, is going to try and overthrow David.
So Absalom was probably a little Nephilim in him too?
He was a hybrid, yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So once you start to understand the dynamics of the Old Testament, things really start to sort of come to life. So David fought and Solomon fought lots of giants and heavily with the remnant of the giants, and less so with Solomon. But yeah, if they capture giants, and I identify giants in those wars that are talked about in the Bible.
Wow, that is crazy. I would have never thought. So I guess Absalom was really leaning back into his genealogy and trying to take his right to rule, as you would say.
Well, can you imagine a hybrid on the Davidic throne?
Wow, that is. I mean, it could be. I mean, King David, or not King David, King Charles III, because supposedly he's a descendant of King David as well.
Yes, through the scioning in of the bloodlines. Yeah. And another freaky one that goes to the same consistent MO to usurp the Davidic kingship and inheritance and blessings that Jesus will ultimately inherit and comes out of those bloodlines is the marriage in Genesis 36 amongst these Horim giants and Amalekim giants. And so Eliphaz, son of Esau, brother of Jacob, Esau is the one who lost the birthright, the blessings, and the Messianic blessing through trickery to Jacob. Mm-hmm. And so now you have Esau. He's going to marry Oholibama, who's a Horim. He's starting another matriarchal dynasty because it's a purebred giant woman, a Horim. And Timnah is the daughter of Seir, of the Dukes of Seir, that's going to create the nation that comes out of Amalek, which is eponymously named by the Amalekim giants that show up in the War of Giants in Genesis 14, which predates by at least a couple hundred years the dating of the birth of Amalek. So that's the creation of the Amalekite hybrids. They're going to go live in Petra alongside the Amalekim giants that are depicted in Genesis 14.
And some of that blood traces down to modern day Edomites, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the bloodline of Herod as well, both an intermarriage between the Amalekites and the Edomites and the
Herod was half Jew and
the
half Edomite, right?
Yeah,
Herod means half Jewish.
He was full. Herod was full Edomite.
Oh, full Edomite.
Okay. Yeah, and it means hero, like in a hero of old, a giant. Again, giving the name in the definition. And so, when we look at that race of the Amalekites, that is the nation that's going to wait for Israel when they come out of the Exodus, when they're not trained for war. They're starving in the Exodus, and they're going to try and wipe them from the face of the earth so they can inherit by Old Testament law the birthright, the blessings, and the Messianic promise, and would have had a hybrid bloodline on that. That's a constant that goes throughout why they want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. Now, here's the connection back to the modern times that you're going to like. We talked about the Albigens, and that is also scioned into King Charles's bloodline as well. And the Dukes of Edom, that word Dukes is Alaf, Alluph and IM for the male plural. The Alephim, as the Catholic Encyclopedia tracks this bloodline. And the Horim are also the Alephim as well. And that's the root word that the allegory for the elf kingdoms or the fairy kingdoms comes from. So when we talk about the fairy folk like the Tuatha De Danann, or the elven bloodline from Elbe and Elbe gens, it's the same term that's being used for the bloodlines that is going to show up downstream, and that anybody that's associated with a Tuatha De Danann bloodline or an elven bloodline is part of that fairy bloodline of the matriarch. And it really sort of comes together in a Gnostic literature written by the Templars and the Priory of Sion, are sponsored by them to fund the writers to do it, with the Holy Grail tales of the bloodlines. And you have Uther Pendragon, which is King Arthur's father. So he's a Pendragon as well. Arthur is dragon bloodline, patriarchal bloodline. And Guinevere is a fairy queen. And Guinevere basically means a spirit or a shade or a shay or a banshee, but like a demonic giant spirit. So that is the Camelot dynasty. That's also intermarried through bloodlines into King Charles's bloodline as well, as part of the Elbigens. And in the Tuatha De Danann, in the Gnostic Cathar Elbigensian sister religion, the Tuatha De Danann Elven bloodline is the bloodline of the dragon Messiah.
So just so the viewers understand, even to this day, the people that are ruling in England, right, the Windsors, they believe in King Arthur, that was a real story, that he comes from some Nephilim with a dragon paternity, and he was married to a fairy, basically.
Yeah.
Wow.
Fairy queen. Yep.
And that's how the royals started, or one of their lines.
One of their lines, yeah. Yeah, so they all have these mythos and genealogies that they keep that go right back to a specific Nephilim or Rephaim patriarch. All the grafting in of bloodlines, and also the specific celestial mafia godfather. So when King James swore his oath to a god, it goes back to not the God of the Bible he's swearing an oath to. This is an ancient right of inheritance from before the flood, and again restarted after the flood, back to a God on the council of the gods. He's the physical, visible representative, as a divine representative who receives the divine right to rule. So you get like the mighty King James, sponsor of the KJV Bible, which turned out to be a good thing, maybe not quite what he had in mind, but and he's a bloodline of the Stuarts, a unicorn dynasty, right? And he has the word wild bull, or ram as it's in Hebrew, substituted with a unicorn.
Wow.
And he's part of the, and in their heraldry, a unicorn is an angelic being as well as a physical being that was the horse that the antediluvian and early post-diluvian giants rode into battle.
Now, before I wear out your mind too much, there's a question that is on my mind now. You said, like you said before, there's that you weren't telling people not to read these other books and stuff like that, but there's certain things that I did not want to read because I knew that its nature was corrupted, and I just didn't want that messing with my head or putting anything in there. But you studied Islam before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from what your understanding is, what's their eschatology? I know one thing that's matched up is people that have spoken between research in eschatology in the Christian front and eschatology from the Islamic front. They're both agreed on one thing, that the rider on the white horse is the Antichrist, basically, is their Mahdi.
Yeah. So
can you tell us a little bit about Islamic eschatology?
Yeah, there's very little there, but I'll talk about it. The first thing I'll say, though, is put on your armor of God when you read non-biblical stuff, so that you're ready for the battle that you're going into. So in the Quran, there's very little prophecy. There's a little bit about the judgment. That's about it. It adds a little bit. It's not a prophecy book. So Muhammad's not much of a prophet. And I don't say that disrespectfully. I'm just saying he's not like Isaiah. I know he's held very high, but from understanding that that's not a lot, there's not a whole bunch of prophecy that's shown in there. I would argue they've discarded the prophecy that they should be looking at from the Old Testament and the New Testament, but that's a different argument. So where they get their Mahdi does, they have one that's for each of the Sunni and the Shia. They're different, and they'll also fight because one has to win out. So that's not in the Quran either. And they get their additional information, and in this case, prophecies from their hadiths. And the hadiths are man-made commentaries of they said, somebody said that Muhammad might have said. And it's not part of the Quran, it's an addition. Otherwise, it'd be in their Quran.
It's
and it'd be
their
the
version
same.
of the Talmud and the Mishnah.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the analogy to use. So you want to be, I would recommend that they would be careful with that. So that's where they get these end time things with the Mahdi. And so it's designed to reinterpret what the Quran says. But what the Quran also says is that everything that's written in the Old Testament and the New Testament is 100% accurate. So they want prophecy, they should be going to the source. They should be interpreting, if that is indeed scripture, as they say it is, they should be going to the Bible to define it and interpret it versus these man-made hadiths. And that they would recognize what the Quran says is that everything written in the Bible is true.
Well, since we're on that, what would you know? And I'm just asking from your take. What would your timeline be for eschatology? From where we are today, how far away do you think we are from tribulation? What happens right after tribulation? Are you pre-trib, post-trib? What happens after the tribulation? What happens after the people are raptured away or whatever? If there's a wrath of God after that, and then how does that transition into the millennial kingdom? And then also the final battle at the end. Is that something that's mentioned in the Bible? Is that Gog versus Magog, or what battle is that?
You have a lot of questions there. Well, I will start and then I'll have to go right sort of back to the beginning. But Gog and Magog, some people and a lot of Christians will say that happens at the end of the millennium, and some people say it's Armageddon, and some people say it's a separate war. We get the timing markers on when Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39 happens. It's in the last days, Ezekiel 38.
What is it? This last days or that last days?
Let me finish. And it happens before second Exodus, which happens in Ezekiel 39 after the army is buried. Second Exodus is the second half of the last 7 years, the time of Jacob's trouble that he saved out of, starting in about Daniel 12, which is the midpoint of the last 7 years. So without getting into a lot of detail, I would put that as the counterfeit Armageddon that Antichrist takes credit for as his Armageddon, and then takes his armies, as the book of Luke and Daniel talks about in Daniel 11, takes his armies into Jerusalem, and then we'll set up the abomination. So let's go now back to the beginning here. Is my
I'm sorry, but you stepped on a question that I wanted to ask you, and I forgot to ask you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the second Exodus? Because I had never heard of it until you mentioned it, and then I was reading in Hosea, not Hosea. I'm sorry, I can't think of it right now. But I was reading and I read about it, like literally right after we talked to each other about.
You'll get second Exodus and Hosea. You get it in most of the Old Testament prophecies, and the reason I think
it was Micah. I think I read it in Micah.
Oh yeah, Micah 5 and 2.
Yeah.
2 and 5, and that's where the breaker is going to break the lost tribes of Israel out of the prisons. And he and King David are going to lead them in the second Exodus. So where it starts with the prophecy for second Exodus is in the Holy Covenant. And that if they were to follow the covenant, they would get the blessings, and we'd have a completely different history. But as we know, they keep violating the covenant, and now they're going to suffer the curses of the covenant. And so our history is played out through the curses of the covenant. And that God promises them, though, that he will bring them all back and call them by name in the end time. And so that's why we need to understand Old Testament prophecies for the lost tribes of Israel that are going to be awakened, which they haven't been awakened yet, and the visible tribe of the southern kingdom, Judah. And not all of them are in Israel. You have some all around the world. And so when you see Judea fleeing from Jerusalem at the time of the abomination in Mark 13 and Matthew 17:21 and Matthew 24, that's the same scene that's shown in Revelation 12, with where the southern kingdom is going to be protected after they flee for 3.5 years. So you know the timing of when this starts to take place in the second half.
And that's where
in
a lot
Daniel
of people
12,
think
you
split,
have
right?
this.
A lot of people think they go to Petra, right? There's a big crack in the ground, and they run to Petra.
It could be. It's just the wilderness, though. So exact location is unknown biblically, but it's in the mountains, it's in the desert, it's in the wilderness. Those are the descriptions that we get. So whether or not that's the same place as the first Exodus, could be. They could be marching around there. We don't know because we're not given a specific place. So in Daniel 12, we have a passage for Daniel's people, Judah and Israel, and there's going to be a judgment and a resurrection of their people after the time of trouble, when Michael rises at the midpoint, at the time of the abomination, as Daniel 12, 1-3 talks about. That's the Hebrew word trouble, Sarah. So in Jeremiah 37, this is the time of Jacob's trouble. Sarah, it means tribulation. It means affliction. It means persecution. Same word for thlipses that's used to translate affliction and tribulation in the New Testament prophecies, and in particular as it relates up as the same timing as the Great Tribulation in Matthew 24:21 and Mark 13:19, where it's a great affliction versus tribulation, same Greek word thlipses, that is going to happen, that hasn't been seen since the beginning of creation. It's a different tribulation than the saints. So there's a couple tribulations that we need to sort of keep in mind. So the timing is in the last 3.5 years. And when you read Hosea 9:7, it's going to happen in the time of the visitations of Jehovah, who is Jehovah of the Elohim. Jehovah is the cognate term for Jehovah of the Elohim as the word of God, the logos of the theos. It's in Greek that it comes out of, but it's referencing the same. And Jehovah is the one who's involved in Old Testament prophecy in the end time, and has been all the way through, and is the one that's going to bring about the day of the Lord, right? So if we got that sort of down, then we understand that in the time of Jacob's trouble, Jehovah, King David, is going to lead them in second Exodus, and he's going to take them to the wilderness to meet up with the people of Judah. Ezekiel 37, one of the most mysterious prophecies in the Bible, with the dry bout and the judgment that Daniel 12 is talking about, and that this is where Israel and Judah are brought in second Exodus into one staff by King David and Jehovah, all part of the prophecies. This is the timing as you fold in the root of Jesse in Isaiah 11, you got Isaiah 49, you got Isaiah 62, other passages where there's an ensign or a standard or a banner, as it's also translated, is going to be shown at the time of the trumpet, as Isaiah 18 talks about, with an ensign that's on the mountain as well. And this is the sign that Jesus displays after the abomination and just before the rapture. So I would place that second Exodus there. And they're going to mourn, as it's talked about in the Old Testament, like in the book of Zechariah and elsewhere. And also you get the same sort of mourning reference at the time of the sign. But in the Old Testament, Israel and Judah are going to mourn, particularly Judah, for the one they pierced at the time of the ensign. They're going to be understand after the abomination at the time of the sign. They're going to understand they've been wrong about A, Antichrist, and B, Jesus, and they're going to accept Jesus as their Messiah, and he is going to lead them in the reign of Antichrist in the year of the Lord's favor to the wilderness and bring them back into the covenant in time for the supper of the bride in Revelation 19.
And
so the church is the bride too, but that's their reconciliation.
So basically, this second Exodus is or when he does that, it's just Jewish people basically,
and Israelite people.
Oh.
Jewish would suggest just 3 to 4 tribes of the southern kingdom.
But like you said, that they're joining the sticks, and I guess a lot of that
they're going to be joined back together under King David.
Like, and there's already
7 shepherds
going
and back. They're going to be led by 7 shepherds and 8 principled men as well, as you put in some more details. It's unbelievable how many passages on second Exodus are in the Old Testament. And you get the same sort of imagery in Revelation 12, where Judea is going to be taken on eagle's wings to the wilderness. The only other time we get that is in the time of the first Exodus.
So
exact same terminology.
So shooting back to the end of all this, there's a final battle, right? The devil's loosed on. He takes some people rebel, and they, basically decide to go against Jesus, even though he's here ruling on earth. After that millennium is done, God whoops him, throws him in, the lake of fire and ice, or the lake of fire, and it's all said and done. Supposedly there's going to be a new earth, a new heaven and a new earth, right? He's making a new heaven and new earth. Well, what does that kind of look like?
We don't know exactly the extent of that. It's that it's in Greek and original Hebrew. When it says a new heaven, heaven can mean 3 things. It can mean the firmament and in, just as the firmament is called heaven in Genesis 1. And it can be outside the firmament, so the balance of the universe. And it also can mean where God dwells. So is it a complete new universe, or is it just what's in from the firmament for a new heaven and a new earth? But it's going to be new for sure. And it's going to be a restart. And what's interesting is we don't get that brand new heaven and earth to start the millennium. We get it afterwards, because there's a time of more testing, and this time for humans who are going to actually rebel at the end of the millennium. So even though they'll have Jesus reigning with them, he'll still be reigning from Jerusalem when they rebel. And after Satan has been released, he's going to lead them to Jerusalem to a war, which they're going to lose instantaneously. But it's to show humankind that we are no better than the angels. Even though we're being raised up in the resurrection sequence to be inheritors of eternity and for angels to serve us, we will know then God intimately as humans and would still rebel. Angels who were created immortal, and we have to get it through the faith and through the resurrection, they had intimate knowledge and were already immortal and still rebelled. And it's just finishing off the details of that. And what happens after that, we don't know. So is it a whole new universe, or is it just with the sun and inwards? And are we going to be doing something else in the complete universe? I mean, we don't know. Now,
go ahead.
You were asking about where are we in the prophetic time period. And where we are is likely in the fig tree generation, which I think would start in 1967 to shortcut it, because Jerusalem has to be in the possession of the southern kingdom to start the end time, because in Jesus's overarching sign in his chronology, he calls it the fig tree generation. He's the one who kills the fig tree just before he goes to the temple and then gives his oration, because the fig tree bears no fruit. In Old Testament prophecy, the southern kingdom's allegory is the fig tree. Israel is the vine.
So
So
Israel had no possession of Jerusalem in 1948?
no, they did not get it till 1967. So they declared their independence in 1947, had the Battle of Independence in 1948, but did not take Jerusalem until 1967 in the 67 Six-Day War. Yeah. So I would say that's likely the start, just because you have to have Jerusalem in their hands. But now a generation can be 40 years, as 40 years in the wilderness. It can be, as the book of Psalms saying, 70 years, or it could be 120 years.
80 with strength.
Yeah. So it could be 120 years as Genesis 6:3, somewhere in between. And there's a lot to happen yet before we would get to the last 7 years that Daniel 9:27 details. And then you overlay the 3.5-year commission of the two witnesses in Revelation 11, and the 3.5-year reign of Antichrist. That's the 7. And so the crowning of Antichrist is the abomination that 2 Thessalonians 2 and the 4 Gospels talks about, and the book of Daniel talks about. That's the midpoint of that last 7 years to get the pieces together in terms of the timing. So I think we're in the fig tree generation. We're not at the opening of the seals yet. And we're in the age of the sorrows, which are earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, and famine. And some people might
the birthing
put
pains.
in
It's not
the
yet, but
surging
it's
of the
very
sea
close.
in the book of Luke. Yeah. So these are the birth pains. They're getting stronger. They're starting to work together, but the destruction. If we were to have 10% destruction of all of the earth and all of the people in a war, people would say that would be Armageddon. But yet, that's not even the destruction of the seal openings, which is 25% destruction of everything. And that's not the destruction of the Gog War, Joel 1 and 2, and Revelation 9. In book 2, I put the description of those beings in Joel 1 and 2 and the descriptions of those beings in Revelation 9. They're identical. And Armageddon happens after Joel 2. And Joel 3, it starts in that prophecy. So
that's when the blood literally turns to blood, and
yeah,
the sun totally disappears.
Yep. And that's the counterfeit Armageddon. And this will happen probably 6 months to a year and a half before the midpoint, where Antichrist afterwards, taking credit for it, will move his armies into Jerusalem that Daniel 11 talks about. You get the timeline of Antichrist rise to power and his 3.5-year major events in Daniel 11. And it's marked right in the middle with the abomination with them coming to power. So that's where you get those events, and you get some of that in Daniel 8 right at the end. And so everything fits sort of perfectly if you just let it sort of slide in with each other and not try and just cherry pick the prophecies. So I think we're in the sorrows. I think we have a lot of major things yet to see come about. So we haven't seen the sacrifices on a wing or an extremity or overspreading of the temple yet. That Antichrist will enshrine for the first 3.5 years before he eliminates that when he comes to power at the midpoint. And so we haven't seen that. We haven't seen Babylon rise, which rules over the 10 kings, just as she's depicted as riding and with controlling the beast of empires with reigns in Revelation 17. We haven't seen that 7th empire of 10 kings set on up world government yet. And I think you need the false prophets of the false religion of Babylon to come into place first. That's going to be the scare tactics, the contrived prophecies to bring these contrived disasters of the birth pangs of the seals and of the trumpets to bring them to power so that they can bring about this 10 king. But there's going to be wars that are involved in all of that as well.
One quick opinion that I want to get from you. Do you think this false religion is going to be some kind of merger of Islam and the Catholic religion coming together?
You might see a little bit of that before, but not in the greater sense. You'll have Islam as a branch of Babylon. You'll have Christianity as a branch. You'll have Judaism as a branch until they recognize Antichrist is the false. Well, an Antichrist actually destroys Babylon and will establish as a new religion, as Daniel 11 talks about that. And he does it after the 10 kings give him his power. He's the little horn that rises up afterwards. And that in Revelation 17, the kings give him the power and he destroys Babylon at that point. That's just after the midpoint of the last 7 years and the timing of it. And so this is going to be the ancient religion of the giants. That's
So is
coming back.
Antichrist alive today?
If we're in the fig tree generation, one would probably think so. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I mean, I didn't really say who, but who do you think is maybe give me 2 or 3 front runners who you think might be it?
Well, you could certainly have from outside the Europeans, you could have President Xi. He comes from the Western bloodline of the Shah dynasty, from the sons of heaven, giants created by the dragon creator gods. He's of that dynasty bloodline, of the Western bloodline. He's one. You have Putyanin bloodline of Kiev, which is the Indo-Aryan Scythian bloodline that established a branch in Moscow with Vladimir the Great in about 1000 AD that changed their name to Romanov with another starting of a scioning in of a female, but still the Putyanin bloodline that Putin, in his mythos, I don't know whether it's true or not, it's just what the newspapers in Russia were saying when he was coming to power, is that his grandfather was born through an intermarriage with one of the Putyanin czars, which are the original czars, and that of the Rurikid bloodline, and that it was an illegitimate birth, so outside the royal families, and so you only receive part of the name, and that his father moved to St. Petersburg just before World War II, which is how he ends up there, and he's just trying to put back the ancient Russian dynasty, but he wants to unite the ancient Kiev city. That's the holy city where he would probably
that's
like
why
to rule
that's
from.
why Putin is so focused on the Ukraine, right?
Yeah. Now, you have in the Gog War, you have Gog, who doesn't show up in the Bible other than where it's depicted in this great war and the one at the end of Revelation. Gog is a giant, son of Iapetus, before the flood. And this happens after the pit prison is opened, the Gog War. But it's Gog of Magog. Magog shows up in the Table of Nations, but that's also a brother of Gog, son of Iapetus. And then you have giants named after the flood that's part of the Gyges bloodlines throughout Assyria and Asia Minor and Greece. There's that were also named Magog. So not sure what mix of the giants might be there allegorically, but it's Gog Magog of Meshech, chief prince of Meshech. Meshech is the etymological root for Moscow. And you have these 5 empires starting to rise up in the east with the Persians of India, the Persians of Iran and Iraq, China, and Russia. That may be the 5 kings on the toes of the one leg that will be pushing against. That may be partially the fulfillment of the 5 toes on each foot. And so he could be an Antichrist type figure, or the one that Antichrist uses to gain his pedigree on. In Europe, you also have the Anjou, have 3 separate bloodline claims to the King of Jerusalem title. And the King of Jerusalem title today is held by King Philippe of Spain, of the Bourbon family, inherited through the von Habsburgs, who make a claim. And
So
this goes back.
Spain still has a a monarchy per se that they kind of like the English in England the monarchies are just for show, but right. So Spain still has a monarchy that's just for
Yeah.
show.
Yeah, but they're more powerful than what people think in the backgrounds. And the royales have all the money, have all the off the books money. It's massive amount. They still pull the strings, and they have their own Masonic orders at the top. So the Masonic order of Royal Masonic Order of Charles III is the senior versus the junior that people generally associate with the order of the Garter. The Anjou is the Order of the Golden Fleece, and the Golden Fleece was the clothing that the fallen angels wore to protect their bodies so that it wouldn't decay in the physical world. The Norse bloodlines that are also intermarried into King Charles's bloodlines and into the Anjou as a scioning, they're called, and it doesn't get any more vivid than this, the Knights of the Seraphim. I kid you not. I kid you not. And so the King of Jerusalem title begins in 1118 with the official title, but actually in 1099 with the starting of taking over Jerusalem by the Templars led by Godfrey de Bouillon, who is of a Merovingian descent and an Anjou. And Hugh de Payon, his battle partner, is also, they're from the Lorraine, and the folk of Anjou is also there. And so he's not crowned king, but he's the ruler. Then you have Baldwin the First, and then officially in 1118, you have the official first king of Jerusalem that is going to start this king of Jerusalem title. And so the Merovingians take their bloodlines back through the Quinatar allegory, which is back to Baphomet, which is the god of the Templars that they worship, which is Father Mitra or Mithra. And again, connecting back as we talked about that Lord Maitreya understanding of Mithra in the original Indo-Aryan, and that this bloodline is taking in other scion bloodlines through the Merovingians. And the Merovingians are going to have the Davidic bloodlines intermarried into them through descendants of the Desponini and or the other members of the Davidic bloodline with the diaspora of Judea. They are going to have bloodlines of King Saul merged into them with the Sincambian Franks, and then they're
That's
going
where
to
you get
have
the mythos from the Da Vinci Code.
yes,
They try to
yes,
use all that into the
yeah. They
that into
wrote
the story.
they called the fiction story based on all of their belief systems, and so the other bloodline comes through the alleged and what they believe the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and that comes through the Camelot dynasties that we talked about, and through Josephus, the third son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, according to the Gnostics. I don't believe it, but that's what they say. And that married into the Camelot dynasties, and then a female Aragon, who's going to carry that matriarchal bloodline, is going to intermarry with Amenabad. Now, Mary Magdalene in that belief system is also from the Benjamite royal bloodline. And what's important about those two Benjamite bloodlines and the Davidic inheritance that Jesus makes claim to and will inherit, but they're trying to usurp that with their own dragon Messiah. Jerusalem was awarded in the time of Joshua and the time of the Exodus to the Benjamites, and King Saul was the first king and a Benjamite. So they lay claim to Jerusalem through those scioning or grafting in of their bloodlines, which again was why genealogy is so important, and wanted to bring about the end time, beginning with the Templars. They've been working on this for a very long time, and that their grand monarch, their Antichrist figure, will be crowned with the King of Jerusalem title when he becomes king of the world.
Man, that was great. Well, I think kind of need to shut this down because I don't know how long it's gonna give me, and I do not want to lose this. because I just have the free version of this. I'm not sure if
Yep,
it's going
no
to cut me
problem.
off. But I really appreciate you coming on today. If you could please do us a favor and pray us out.
Yeah. Father in heaven, we thank you for bringing Sergio and myself together. We thank you for the ability to communicate on the internet and to go into places and theaters that we normally could not get, and to speak your word and to talk about you and what you have planned for us and how things work, and maybe start to prepare people for what is coming. And hopefully we'll also be blessed and start to spread more information so that people can be more aware of the times, if indeed we're in the fig tree generation. And we pray these things in the name of our Redeemer, the Word Jesus, who sits at your right hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints. We also pray in the name of the Holy Spirit in your great and holy name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you guys for joining us, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Grotto in the Tar Pit.